Settlement of Esterhazy Mural by Jocelyn Duchek. Through 10 panels, local artist Jocelyn Duchek has captured Esterhazy through the ages and has shown how this town and area has grown. Jocelyn cites that, as the artist, I tried to capture the spirit of this place, the people, and the time in the town in which they lived. I chose to start the mural at the dawning of the new day to symbolize the start of a new era in this region. The final panel closes the day in the present period, but it is certainly not the end of the story. Many of the panels in the mural represent different time periods. Panels 2 and 3 represent a time before the 1880s. In a time before the Europeans began to explore Canada and its vast land and resources, nomadic Indigenous peoples roamed the area. During this time, huge bison herds in the southern plains and parklands provided food, clothing, and shelter for the people. The Indigenous peoples of this time adapted to the challenges of the prairie environment and held close relationships with the animals and land they relied on. The strength they had was nurtured by a deep spirituality and rich ceremonial life, part of which is the teepee. The teepee, a shelter which they built, was durable, warm, and comfortable in the winter, dry during heavy rains, and cool in the heat of the summer. These teepees could be disassembled and packed away quickly when it was time to move, which was important for their nomadic lifestyles. While the teepee provided shelter, it was much, much more. The teepee was a sacred space, a symbol, and a ceremony. Everything about a teepee has a meaning and a lesson to be taught. These teachings relate to the nurturing spiritual, physical, emotional, and mental part of ourselves. Panel 4 represents the Esterhazy area from 1880 to 1900. It was starting in 1882 that immigrants started to settle in the area surrounding the now town of Esterhazy. 4 years later, in 1886, it was Count Paul Esterhazy who founded a colony of 35 Hungarian families south of the town. Following in Count Paul's footsteps, large numbers of Czech and Slovak families arrived at the Esterhazy colony in the same year. In this period of time, immigrants arrived in the area via train from Winnipeg, Manitoba. The main line went through Whitewood, a mere 30 miles from where they settled. This trip was by no means easy and took many days to travel. Oxen were used to pull Red River carts across the rough terrain, but the immigrants did not have the luxury of riding in these carts. Instead, they followed alongside while their carts held their precious belongings. At night, they used what they could to make tents for shelters, though most often it was under the cart. Over time, the journey became easier with the introduction of the chuck wagon, which had room to hold both them and their belongings inside, and the wagon itself could be used for shelter at night. As the Hungarian settlement grew and spread towards the Kopel River, the colony began to be known as Kaposvár. The Kaposvár church is at the heart of the first Hungarian homesteads and was built in 1906 using more than 1,600 loads of local fieldstone, which was hauled by sleighs in the winter. This site is now recognized as a heritage site and remains open for tours to the public. Many settlers left the area after the first hard winter, but Count Esterhazy brought more colonists in 1888. By 1902, the settlements in the area had a population of more than 900 settlers on 200 homesteads, with 14,000 acres of land under cultivation. The Count's name was eventually given to the village when Esterhazy was officially founded in 1905. Moving on to Panel 5, which features Esterhazy from 1900 to 1920. When the weather was cold, pioneers were forced to build a snug home quickly in order to be protected from the harsh weather. The preferred home was often a sod house. The sod used to build the house was first cut into strips, and then a spade was used to lift the blocks. It took around 1 acre of sod to build the house. Some opted to build their sod houses into the ground so that they were only partly above the surface. These houses could accommodate normal doors and windows. These houses were well insulated, inexpensive, but often damp. Additionally, these houses required frequent maintenance and were vulnerable to damage from the rain. While the outside walls were often covered in either straw, clay, or manure, canvas or plaster lined the interior walls. Each sod house was built by hand, and the design varied based on the builder and owner. Other homesteaders who had the means built A-frame houses on their land. Over time, these houses grew larger and reflected the prosperity achieved by some. Although these wooden shacks were not very elaborate, they were a big step above the sod houses. While World War I brought more heartache and pain, it also brought a big round of growth for the area. During this time, grain prices rose, and good quality crops brought unequaled prosperity to farmers. It was during this time that people began to replace their settlement shacks with permanent houses. The catalog and mail-order houses, especially the Eaton's catalog, played a big part in allowing this transition to happen. The first Eaton's catalog was an attractive 8-room house. It was a simple 2-story, gable-ended design with a full veranda and a back porch. This design was repeated many times over the next 22 years. A well-known example of the Eaton house was the house of Daisy Hill, which can be seen in the mural behind the sod house. Panel 6 brings us into 1920 through 1940. It was during this time that the then village of Estrahesi reached a population of 500 people. The house in this panel of the mural once belonged to the owner of the lumber yard and is still standing today. While the pine trees have grown since this time, the house is still recognizable due to its stone fence that frames the yard. While this house is now located by local gas station Fast Gas, it was once located on the edge of town. Panels 8 and 9 feature Esterhazy from the 1950s to the 1990s. During this time, the population of Esterhazy boomed when the multi-million-dollar potash mine was established near Esterhazy in 1962. The arrival of the mines brought further economic and social growth to the community. By the 1970s, sidewalks, paved streets, running water, and sewer systems were commonplace. From the 1970s to the 1990s, the population of Esterhazy reached its peak before once again beginning to decline. There was very little building going on during the time, and many people began to leave the province in search of employment. Panel 10 brings Esterhazy into the modern day. Many of the families who left in the 80s and 90s have started to return. Once again, immigrants from other countries are starting to call Esterhazy home as the growing development in the area increases the need for workers. During this time, houses are growing in size and the area is alive and rich with the cultural diversity that once again fuels the atmosphere. Currently, another boost has arrived in the area with the development of the K3 expansion. Much has changed since this mural was finished in 2013, but Esterhazy continues to thrive in present day, as do the people who live inside it. We'd like to take a moment to thank local artist Jocelyn Duchek for painting this beautiful mural that depicts our lovely town. Thank you. You'd be crazy to not subscribe to Esterhazy Community Museum's YouTube page.